October 1924. 5 men die screaming in a New Jersey refinery, their minds shattered by something in the gasoline they were making. Their deaths exposed a secret that General Motors and Standard Oil had been hiding. The miracle fuel additive that made cars run smoother was also one of the deadliest neurotoxins known to science. For the next 50 years, every car in America would spew lead into the air. Every child would breathe it. Every brain would absorb it. And by the time anyone realized the damage, generations had already been poisoned. Then in 1975, the government mandated unleaded fuel. Not to stop the poisoning. They didn't even mention that. They did it to save catalytic converters. But that accidental decision would end up reversing one of the largest public health disasters in human history. This is how trying to clean car exhaust accidentally saved millions of minds, dropped crime rates by half, and exposed the biggest corporate cover-up of the 20th century. December 9, 1921. Thomas Migley, Jr., working in General Motors laboratory in Dayton, Ohio, reported to his boss that he'd discovered tetraethyl lead worked to reduce engine knock. The compound eliminated the metallic pinging that plagued high-compression engines, allowing manufacturers to build more powerful, more efficient motors. Tetraethyl lead was first discovered by a German chemist in 1854 and was not used commercially on account of its known deadliness. It caused hallucinations, breathing difficulty, and in severe cases, madness and death. 67 years after its invention, it remained a laboratory curiosity specifically because everyone knew it was dangerous. But Migley had tested thousands of compounds looking for an anti-knock agent. Lead worked better than anything else. 1 part tetraethyl lead to 1/300 parts gasoline eliminated knock completely, and compared to alternatives like ethanol, lead was incredibly profitable. The Ethyl Corporation, formed by GM and Standard Oil, could charge premium prices for what cost pennies to manufacture. Here's the part that makes this story truly criminal. Migley had patented an alcohol-gasoline blend just 5 years earlier. Ethanol worked perfectly as an anti-knock agent. It burned clean, produced no toxic residue, and could be made from agricultural products. Alice Hamilton, a Harvard professor of public health, told reporters that men who could discover the fuel value of tetraethyl certainly could invent something equally efficient and in no way dangerous. Alternatives were available and obvious to anyone looking, but ethanol had a problem. It couldn't be patented. Any refinery could blend alcohol with gasoline. Lead, however, was protected intellectual property. GM and Standard Oil could control production, set prices, and generate enormous profits. The economics were too compelling to ignore. A DuPont legal history noted that an important special motive for the original research was GM's desire to fortify itself against gasoline supply exhaustion, with the thought that high-compression motors could be switched to ethyl alcohol. Lead was meant to be a bridge to alternative fuels. Instead, it became a 50-year dead end. Manufacturing tetraethyl lead was a nightmare. The industrial chemist widely given credit for discovering the compound, Thomas Migley, was forced to leave his job for several months in 1923 to recuperate from lead poisoning. Even the inventor couldn't handle his own creation. From 1923 to 1925, several workers suffered agonizing deaths from acute lead poisoning at the first plants built by General Motors, DuPont, and Standard Oil for producing tetraethyl lead on an industrial scale. The men went insane before they died. Hallucinations, violent behavior, total mental collapse. The October 1924 deaths in New Jersey triggered public outrage. Newspapers called lead a creeping and malicious poison. Public health advocates demanded immediate bans. The New York Times quoted Alice Hamilton urging men connected with the industry to put aside the lead compound entirely and try to find something else. The response from industry? A propaganda campaign. They renamed it ethyl to avoid mentioning lead. They claimed no alternatives existed. They hired friendly scientists to testify that tiny amounts in gasoline posed no public health risk. And it worked. By 1926, leaded gasoline was cleared for sale nationwide. Throughout the 60-year period from 1926 to 1985, an estimated 20 trillion liters of leaded gasoline at an average lead concentration of 0.4 grams per liter were produced and sold in the United States alone, equivalent to 8 million tons of inorganic lead, 3/4 of which would have been emitted as lead chloride and lead bromide. What nobody realized, what wouldn't be proven for another 40 years, was that lead doesn't just kill refinery workers exposed to concentrated doses. Lead at any level damages developing brains, and every child in America was breathing it every single day. The damage was invisible, cumulative, and catastrophic. But it would take a geochemist with an obsession and decades of detective work to prove it. Claire Patterson wasn't trying to expose a public health crisis. In the 1950s, he was trying to determine the age of the Earth using lead isotope ratios in ancient rocks. Lead kept appearing in his laboratory equipment, his reagents, even the air. Patterson pioneered research showing just how much lead could be found in the environment, pinpointing the likely culprit as tetraethyl lead from gasoline emitted from car tailpipes as very fine lead particles. His measurements revealed something shocking. Lead levels in the modern environment were hundreds of times higher than natural background levels. The lead industry attacked him viciously. They questioned his credentials, his methods, his motives. They funded opposing research that contradicted his findings. But Patterson's data was irrefutable. Lead from gasoline exhaust had contaminated everything: soil, water, food, and human bodies. The biological impact was devastating. Damage to the nervous system from lead exposure can result in reduction in overall cognitive function, negative behavioral changes, lowered IQ scores, decreased learning ability, poor memory scores, and impaired comprehension and reading abilities. The impacts on the pediatric population are particularly severe, as children demonstrate consistently higher physiological uptake of lead than adults, predisposing them to irreversible neurological impacts. Developing brains absorb lead more readily and suffer more permanent damage. Essentially, everyone born during the 1960s and 1970s are all but guaranteed to have been exposed to pernicious levels of lead from car exhaust. Peak exposure coincided with the baby boom. An entire generation was being poisoned during their most critical developmental years. The effects were subtle but devastating. A few IQ points lost here, impulse control damaged there, aggression increased slightly. Multiply that across millions of children, and the societal impact becomes staggering. Lead exposure contributes to lower IQ and increased impulsivity, aggressiveness, and low IQ that are strongly associated with criminal behavior. But for decades, nobody connected these dots. Crime rates rose throughout the 1960s and 70s. Politicians blamed poverty, broken families, cultural decay. They never suspected gasoline. The lead content of gasoline rose steadily from the 1940s until about 1970, after which point it fell quickly. The violent crime rate followed exactly the same shape, only delayed by about 20 years. Children exposed to peak lead levels in the 1960s became the high crime cohorts of the 1980s. The correlation was perfect. States with higher gasoline lead consumption saw larger crime increases 20 years later. When lead exposure dropped, crime dropped in lockstep. The same pattern appeared in every industrialized country that phased out leaded gasoline. But even as evidence mounted, nothing changed. The lead industry was too powerful, too profitable, too entrenched. It would take a completely different problem to finally end the poisoning. The catalytic converter wasn't invented to save children from brain damage. It was invented to reduce smog. And when the government mandated them in 1975, they accidentally triggered the end of the biggest poisoning crisis in American history. If this kind of deep dive, where engineering decisions accidentally reshape public health and society, is what you're looking for, subscribe to Hidden Gears. The next videos in this series reveal more technical choices that changed America in ways nobody predicted. The U.S. Environmental Protection Agency announced in 1972 that leaded gasoline would be phased out, not specifically to combat lead poisoning, but because lead interfered with new smog-reducing catalytic converters that from 1975 would be built into new cars. The chemistry was simple. Catalytic converters used platinum and palladium to transform pollutants into harmless gases. But lead poisoned the catalyst, rendering it useless within a few thousand miles. Either the EPA had to abandon catalytic converters, or gasoline had to lose its lead. The auto industry fought hard. They claimed unleaded fuel would damage engines. They insisted cars would lose power and efficiency. They predicted catastrophic economic impacts. Every argument the lead industry had used for 50 years came roaring back. But the EPA held firm. The United States achieved total elimination of sales of leaded gasoline for on-road vehicles on January 1, 1996. The phase-out happened gradually, giving manufacturers time to adapt. But it happened. And nobody was talking about brain damage or crime rates. The whole discussion focused on air quality and smog reduction. The massive public health benefit was almost an afterthought. In the 1970s, epidemiologists found that elevated blood lead levels were associated with lower IQ and increased rates of behavioral disturbance, and lead in petrol was identified as the primary source of environmental lead exposure. According to the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, between 1976 and 2002, average blood lead levels in children aged 1 to 5 decreased from 15.0 to 1.9 micrograms per deciliter, nearly 90% reduction in just 2 decades. The results were dramatic. Exposure to car exhaust from leaded gas during childhood stole a collective 824 million IQ points from more than 170 million Americans alive today. As unleaded fuel replaced leaded gas, those losses stopped accumulating. People born in the mid to late 1960s may have lost up to 6 IQ points, with children registering the highest blood lead levels potentially losing more than 7 IQ points on average. Every cohort born after 1980 did progressively better. The crime effects took longer to manifest, but when they hit, they were unmistakable. Research suggests that childhood lead exposure may lead to higher violent crime rates, and a large portion of the decline in U.S. violent crime between 1992 and 2002 may be attributable to reductions in gasoline lead exposure. The reduction in childhood lead exposure in the late 1970s and early 1980s was responsible for significant declines in violent crime in the 1990s. The magnitude was staggering. Research estimated lead removal explained more than half the crime drop. States that phased out leaded gas earlier saw crime decline earlier. States that dragged their feet saw delayed benefits. A study found that a 10% change in lead exposure from gasoline corresponded to an 8% change in violent crime 2 decades later. The elasticity of violent crime with respect to lead is approximately 0.8. Translation: removing lead from gas was one of the most effective crime prevention programs in history, and it happened completely by accident. The unleaded fuel mandate worked. Blood lead levels plummeted. IQ scores rose. Crime dropped. But the story doesn't end there. Because 50 years of contamination doesn't just disappear, and the lead industry's lies created problems that persist today. The leaded gasoline story is a masterclass in how corporations manipulate science, buy influence, and prioritize profit over human life. For 50 years, the lead industry knew their product was poisoning children. They had the research. They saw the evidence. They chose to lie. They renamed the product to hide what it was. They funded friendly researchers to contradict independent science. They attacked critics personally and professionally. They claimed no alternatives existed when alternatives had existed all along. And it worked. For half a century, it worked. The only reason it ended was catalytic converters. If the EPA had chosen a different emissions control technology, leaded gasoline might still be poisoning children today. The greatest public health victory of the 20th century happened because of tailpipe emissions, not because anyone cared about neurotoxicity. That should terrify everyone. The net social value of the lead phase-out and associated crime reductions is large. The cost of removing lead from gasoline is approximately 20 times smaller than the full value of the crime reductions. Eliminating lead from gas was one of the highest return public health interventions in history. The unleaded fuel mandate saved millions of minds, prevented millions of crimes, and improved countless lives. And it happened completely by accident, as a side effect of smog control, because nobody in power cared enough about neurotoxicity to act directly. That's the real lesson. Progress often comes from unexpected directions. The most important solutions sometimes arrive for entirely wrong reasons. And the fight to protect public health against corporate profit never ends. It just changes chemicals. Here's what to ask. What's today's leaded gasoline? What profitable product are corporations defending right now, downplaying health risks, funding friendly research, and claiming has no alternatives? Because the pattern is still running. The next catastrophic exposure is probably already happening. And just like with lead, by the time definitive proof arrives, generations will already be damaged. That's the story of how catalytic converters accidentally ended a 50-year poisoning crisis. If engineering decisions and their unintended consequences fascinate you, hit that subscribe button